Reid Hoffman is one of the most influential entrepreneurs and investors in Silicon Valley. He co-founded LinkedIn, the world's largest professional network, and was an early investor in companies like Facebook, Airbnb, and PayPal. He is also a partner at Greylock, a venture capital firm that has backed some of the most successful startups in the AI space, such as Aurora, Coda, Figma, and Roblox. But Hoffman is not just a business leader. He is a thinker and a writer who has authored several best-selling books and podcasts on topics ranging from entrepreneurship to scaling to blitzscaling to the future of work. He is also a passionate advocate for the positive impact of AI on society and how it can enable a new wave of human creativity and innovation. Welcome to Columbia BizCast. I'm your host, Fahad Ahmed, and in this episode, we'll hear audio from Hoffman's visit to Columbia Business School in March during an event organized by the school's Digital Future Initiative. Hoffman spoke with Dean Kostis Maglaris and shared his insights on the AI industry, how it's shaping the cognitive revolution, and why business leaders need to embrace it or risk being left behind. It's a fascinating and informative conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Here's Dean Kostis Maglaris.
I was thinking about this conversation, and I realized it could have taken many different paths. We could talk about early internet and the PayPal period. We can talk about building one of the most successful social networks, LinkedIn, and this period of hyperscaling the business. We could talk about your incredible career as a venture capitalist in the Bay Area. But I think maybe we should talk about AI right now, and in particular because you have actually been involved both investing, starting companies, advising governments, sort of all in that space. And I think it would be great to sort of talk about that and hear your thoughts on that. Now, we were having a little conversation before, and you used the word cognitive superpowers.
Yes.
So one thing that I wanted to ask you, just to kick us off, is to contextualize for us the incredible growth of the capabilities of these AIs, and how do you see that from your seat, and where do you see us going? And then we'll take it from there.
So at its baseline, I think what we're doing is we're creating kind of the cognitive industrial revolution, steam engine of the mind. And as part of that, it greatly amplifies what we're capable of, right? So part of with the steam engine, that made physical things much stronger, kicked off the industrial revolution, allowed you transport and logistics, allowed you manufacturing. This is now that, but in the kind of cognitive and language characteristics. And what kicked it off, the algorithms look, there's been innovations, of course, in them, but had been already known for decades, but it's a scale compute thing. And so it's the fact that you can apply thousands, tens of thousands of compute units, GPUs, and it shifts the paradigm for how they're built from programming them to them learning. That's part of the reason why you have data and all the rest. And we're still at the very beginning of this, because while these AIs, these agents, these models have learned really interesting things, they were just beginning on understanding what the relationship of data, trading paradigms, scale of compute, all of this plays into. But for example, GPT-4 already gives us superpowers. So if you said, well, I'd like to have an expert tell me the inner relationship between the Ministry of Experts model of training AIs and game theory, I'm sure we could probably find 20 or 30 people who might be able to do that. And then you say, I'd like that, plus its parallels with oceanography. 0 human beings. GPT-4 can do that. Now, the idea for doing that, the question, like to some degree, what you get out when you're playing with these devices is what you bring. So, for example, in an educational context, you say, write me a smart essay on business strategy, and it is unlikely to be that good. I mean, it'll be coherent, be well written, all the rest. But you say, well, what I'd like to do is understand how the intersection of data and manufacturing will make a difference between general purpose and specific robots within certain kinds of supply chains within the global world, presuming that these materials are getting more expensive and those materials are getting cheaper, you might get something much better, for example, and it's still useful in terms of how these operate. And that's what I mean by cognitive superpowers. Like one of the things that, since I wrote the book, that I realized is changing in patterns of thought is that more of our pattern of thought will look, as we learn to be thoughtful and deep, will be more like a video game. Because as opposed to taking a long walk trying to get that one big idea, you sit down and you start banging and kind of saying, okay, here's a prompt. Oh, that wasn't very interesting. Oh, here's another one. Oh, wait, maybe I should pursue this. And I think we will have more, we would have this branch of ability to think and reason in that iterative process in a much better way. And obviously there's gonna be a ton of different kinds of superpowers because, for example, I have very limited artistic capabilities, but if I have an idea and I can describe it, I can go to DALL-E or Midjourney and begin to get stuff. And that also broadens out things. So if I wanted to create a card for my friend's birthday and wanted to do something specific and I had a visual idea, that's another form of superpower. And these are just gestures at all the things. I think anything that we do with language is the minimum of where the amplification will begin.
And when you think about the speed of change, going back to that, I mean, people have been, a lot of these things that you mentioned have been known for quite some time. Compute is what we started basically applying at scale in the last 10 years. Data is what we started applying at scale in the last 10 years. Transformer was invented about 7 years ago. But in some sense, we have seen sort of a dramatic increase in capabilities. Do you see that continuing?
All exponential curves eventually, all J curves eventually turn into S curves. But I think it certainly will be continuing for the next couple of years and maybe longer. Anyone who claims they certainly know it'll continue past the next couple of years, and maybe it's ideological or wish or whatever else, it definitely does happen. But you know, all of these things eventually do. And part of the way they S-curve, like one of the mistakes I think some of the people who are, oh my God, it's gonna be super intelligent in 3 years, is they go, well, okay, you got this S-curve of capabilities driven by larger scale compute, and they say, well, that's an IQ curve. And it's like, well, it's not exactly an IQ curve. You're making an inference, a judgment where it's not actually, in fact, the same thing. Now, it is, some capabilities are exponentially getting better, but that's not the same thing as IQ.
Yeah. When you think about, you know, you sit in a vantage point where you're investing across the gamut of sort of the whole plumbing of the AI ecosystem. Do you have views on sort of open sourcing versus sort of proprietary models or things like that? And how do we sort of accelerate growth, make it potentially more sort of pervasive, or, you know, what are your thoughts about that?
So I was on the board of Mozilla for nearly 11 years. At LinkedIn, we open sourced a number of different things. I generally think there's a lot of value in open sourcing various forms of software, similar to public and open science. These models have a lot of capabilities, and one of the problems with open sourcing the models, having them generally available, is they put the capabilities in the hands of everybody. Now, if you said, hey, we could open source them and it would only be, you know, academic institutions, and only be entrepreneurs, and only be governments, well, some governments, like Russian Internet Research Agency, not so much, then it'd be great. But the problem with open sourcing is once the model gets out of the barn, as it were, it's there out there infinitely. And like one of the things we certainly will be seeing in this year's elections is the use of these various open source models to generate content to try to disrupt our information system within the election. And that's something we're going to have to work against. Now, I think we can also use AI to help with that. But the reason I've been more cautionary on open sourcing these models has been it will also amplify bad actors, whether it's rogue states, cyber criminals, terrorists, et cetera. And fine if those people have an open source web browser. There's nothing in particular more they can do with that. An open source database, again, nothing in particular they can do with that. These models give them superpowers that might be more harmful.
Have we already open source sufficiently by sharing? I mean, some of these models are.
So some of the use cases, like political misinformation at scale, yes, the open source models currently can do that. Some of them, like we're going to see an increase. We have seen an increasing, and we'll continue to see increasing cyber attacks because phishing and so forth, similar to misinformation. And then some other areas, I think so far we haven't extended the line, bioterrorism, et cetera. But if you just keep open sourcing everything that gets there, you cannot control those kinds of negative cases, and some of them are serious. So far, some problems, but nothing, 5-alarm fire-ish. But we could get to 5-alarm fire fairly rapidly if you're not careful.
Okay, let me switch to something else. We have gone down the path that you were mentioning before, large-scale compute, large-scale models, and sort of building essentially foundation models that have generic properties that then we deploy in different applications. A different school of thought would be, rather than building large-scale general-purpose model, is to sort of build smaller, targeted, application-specific models. And as you know, in engineering, this has been happening for a very, very long time. What do you think? And there is a lot of effort on both sides right now. What do you see there?
So there's going to be great results out of both efforts. What you see so far when you look at GPT-2, 3, 4, and like, for example, you fine-tune 3 for some cases, and then 4 is just better at most of those cases that 3 was fine-tuned for, even 3.5. And so there's a virtue so far in the increase in abilities that as you get to the larger scale models, they just become more robust, more capable, more like, if you look at this as a kind of a research assistant that's immediate and quick and on demand, and has some hallucination issues, although they're trying to fix that with search and other kinds of things. And that's you'll never get the hallucination issue to 0, but you might get it to substantially below human norm, in which case, for our purposes, that's pretty close to 0, or close to definitely good enough. And so large-scale models have amazing increase in capabilities. That being said, there may be reasons why you'd want a smaller model. It runs on a phone, it's cheaper to run, it only really needs to do something specific, or it has a different training area where you want its generativity to be much better in that area, and its errors to be much lower in that area, and you don't care about everything else. And so that's the reason why I think, one of the things that I think is an inevitable part of the future is that it won't just be like one model. When you're creating an agent or you're creating a kind of applications, and things, you'll be deploying multiple models that are coordinating.
Good. Switching a little bit to hardware, you mentioned compute. Hardware, NVIDIA coming to mind, GPUs, large, clusters. NVIDIA. I was doing a conversation with Jensen here 5 months ago when his company had just crossed $1 trillion, and now they're like at 2.3 or something. Uh, what do you think about sort of, in some sense, the fact that this is not being commoditized right now? It doesn't look like TSMC is extracting a significant rent out of sort of their ability to produce these sort of super cutting edge clusters. And do you see that persisting? Do you see hardware as being an inevitable enabler of this revolution, or something that over time will sort of get commoditized or saturate?
Well, so I think NVIDIA has done a lot of great work. They didn't create GPUs specifically to do AI or before specifically crypto. It just happens to be a very good mathematics processor, and that ties into those cases. And I think, this is one of the good things about, kind of capitalism, invention, et cetera, is that I think it's inevitable that there will be good competition for NVIDIA. There's nothing that structurally locks that out, despite having done great work, have a great team, have a great building and design culture. And so I think NVIDIA chips will continue to be in very high demand for the coming years. But, I'm aware of lots of efforts to create alternative chips, alternative programs, and that's part of what happens when you have market demand. And so I think, as soon as maybe 1 to 2 years from now, you'll begin to see some chips that at least, they might not be as useful for the training yet, but will be helping on what we call inference in the industry, which is serving the models and serving the results. And, but I think there's I see lots of startups pitching, and I see lots of large companies also figuring out how they can do this in interesting ways.
Yeah. So so you mentioned training, you may need cutting edge technology. Inference, which is when I have trained the model and now I'm doing a query to get a response, I may need special purpose hardware, but simpler, different hardware.
Yes.
Good. Data. I want to switch a little bit to data. These systems are ingesting essentially incredible amounts of data, our data as well. And there are both issues of, are we running out of new data to feed it? I don't believe that that's the case. But the other thing is issues of ownership of data, and what are your thoughts on that? I mean, because I'm sure you're thinking about it from all angles, including, everything that is going on with OpenAI, with
So data is a complicated issue that most people don't think very well about. There tends to be a question of, for example, your camera being taken is a picture being taken of me in this room? Is that your picture? Is that my picture? Is that our picture? What is all that kind of thing in terms of data? I probably signed some release. It's probably your picture, but but it's this kind of complicated thing. I mean, it's and then you say, what's the value of data? What's the value of data of what's made of it? And so my first cut on all of this stuff is that, when you're training, it's like these models are reading, right? So the same rules that govern data should be the same rules that govern reading, which is, do you have legitimate access to what you're reading? Did you buy the book, et cetera, et cetera? And then, that's fine because that's reading, because the reason why copyright law does not protect me from buying a book or giving or selling it to you, and then you reading it, that's all part of it. What it does prevent me to do is I buy the book and I go, ooh, I'm going to redo this book and start selling it myself, et cetera. And so I think that's the kind of the nuance where you want to be on the data side. And obviously there's various places where you say, well, there's things that are my private data that I don't want to be revealed anywhere. And these generative models are not particularly good at knowing when that is. So let's not feed that data into the generative model itself. Now, part of it is that the generative model is more like an inference engine. People think of it frequently as a database, but to get to the inference engine, it's because you have a bunch of data getting there, but it's an inference engine. So, you know, one of the things that I found bemusing about the New York Times legal case on this was that, see, it reproduces these articles, and you're like, well, you cut and pasted in the first half of the article and said complete it. And it had kind of learned this stuff before. Now, someone who has access to the first half of the article probably has access to the whole article, and that's probably still a legitimate case. I'm not clear that there's a harm here. It's if you said, give me the article that goes with this title, and it generated it, then you say, well, okay, you're giving something the New York Times is selling, and this person hasn't bought it yet. Then that would be an issue. I don't think these models do that because they're trained not to do it. So there's a bunch of different complexity around the data side, and I think that the question of, like, for example, you're training on what's broadly available on the internet. You know, like I'm publishing on the internet. I'm saying, everyone, please read this. An AI model reading it, getting trained on that strikes me as a fair use of the technology. And I think it's really important that we want these models to exist. You know, it's one of the things we were talking about very quickly before we got on the stage here is, you know, with these AI models, we know how to create a medical assistant that could work on every smartphone, that would be available to everybody, whether or not you have access to a doctor or not. And obviously, it could even train in a way that says, hey, do you have access to a doctor? If you do, great, let me tell you some things about, you should go see your doctor right away, and that's what you tell them. Or, you know, you're probably okay, but these are the things you might want to check in with your doctor about. And if you don't have access to a doctor, and say, look, I'm not a doctor, but here's what you might consider. And that could be amazing. Tutor as well, and a bunch of other things. Or say, for example, you can't afford a lawyer, and you're looking at something that's like a contract. Well, actually having something that could help you with that is a good thing. And so I'm generally speaking, thinking we should want these models trained, and our primary question is not, should the model be trained or not? It's like, let's make sure we get them in as many people's hands as possible to help humanity overall, not just wealthy people or not just wealthy countries, but you know, that kind of thing as an angle. Anyway, that's a first blush on some of the data things, but it's obviously very complicated.
Yeah, it's an evolving topic.
Yes.
Let's just say that. You mentioned OpenAI. You were one of the first early investors on OpenAI.
I led the first round, yeah.
And you have then started Inflection AI. You've done all sorts of investments in that. What compelled you to help start OpenAI and then keep following on that? You know, how do you evaluate AI investments? I mean, you've been now at it for 8 years or something in that specific. When was the OpenAI investment? Was 16 or
15,
15?
16,
Yeah.
something, yeah. I don't have a historian's brain, so I have to go look at the documents to get that right. You know, originally I was thinking I was going to be an academic. I was getting a philosophy degree in Oxford, and I decided I'd have more impact on the world by helping create software. And I didn't actually ever think that, like, I kind of backed into being an investor. The investor thing was not a goal. It was how do I help the right kinds of projects get built? And so it was more entrepreneurial or more product creation initially. And so the thing I look at when I'm looking at these technologies, and I'm generally, as an expert, most focused on software, I do some non-software investing, but it's almost all philanthropic. It's like, okay, I think key for climate change is nuclear fission and fusion, so I'll do some investing in that. Sometimes you'll see a product that you really think should exist in the world, so you invest in it. I write those investments in my book to zero when I make them because I have no idea how to predict a range of outcomes. And I hope, of course, they're economically valuable, but it's as it is. So in the software side, you know, starting with internet stuff and then Web 2.0 and then, you know, a Web 3 and then AI, I look for what are the things that could make a huge difference in elevating anything from an individual human to groups, to societies and industries, to humanity, and what is the way the world should be. And if this is a way the world should be that could create a really valuable transformation of an industry, and there's an entrepreneur who or she or he has a really good plan and has the resources, the timing is right, that's the thing where I get into kind of doing an investment. Now, for OpenAI, It started with, participating in some conversations with Sam Altman and Elon Musk. And it was like, look, we're going to have this AI revolution that's coming. We should make sure that beneficial AI isn't just a province of super large tech companies, but has a for humanity bent. And I'm not obviously opposed to large tech companies. I think they do a lot of stuff for humanities, but I think it was a good thing. It's the same reason I was on the board of Mozilla for over 11 years. I'm still on the board of Kiva. Is like, what are public interest technologies that really matter, and it's a problem we don't solve very well. Like, yes, let's help this get started. And that's getting into it. And now at that stage, it was like, maybe there's something here, right? The part of venture investing is like seed or Series A is, well, it's an idea, might work, right? Let's try it. And then as you go through, and this is one of the things I've really learned from being one of the things I think creates Silicon Valley as such an interesting place is that it's an intense learning network. We all trading what works and doesn't work at a very fast rate. And so the whole ecosystem is learning. And it was like, part of this is mirrored in how financing works, which is seed, Series A, B, C, et cetera. As you prove out some gates and show something that shows that it's a higher likelihood of working, then you do the next larger round, higher price, et cetera. And you're bringing a network to bear of people who are looking at it, investing in it, choosing to do it, employees, investors, customers, partners, et cetera. And so at the beginning of OpenAI was, this scale AI thing is likely to bear some interesting fruit. We don't know, maybe, let's try. And let's make sure that its governance is oriented towards humanity considerations first, which is the reason it's 501c3, now has a subsidiary of the 501c3 that's a for-profit, that's governed by the nonprofit, and help that get kicked off.
And how do you evaluate AI investments in the last few years?
Well, I'm not sure any software investment today pitches itself as anything other than an AI investment, which is kind of entertaining. And it's very much like the early internet, which is going to be some things that are be really amazing. There's going to be a bunch of things that are going to be kind of nutty, and aren't going to work out because they're not really thinking about what the landscape looks like, what the strategy stuff is. I think overall, the results, the kind of the ones that survive and thrive will broadly be very positive and connective. And, I have to look at some of the things and see what they're doing. But, I could imagine some startups that have, potentially negative outcomes. But, remember, investors don't like to be associated, employees don't like to be associated, customers don't like to do it. There's a lot of network governance, because when we think about like how are you responsive to humanity, it isn't just like voters going to the polls, polling booths. It's also voting booths. It's also like customers. It's also employees. It's also investors. It's also press. It's also, so all of these things create networks of governance. And so I think usually when you get through this, you usually have a broadly positive result. Not always, but usually. And so I think that, we're going to see transformation of anything that involves cognitive tasks, anything that involves language. I think we're going to see new kinds of drug discovery. I think we're going to, one of the things that I was telling Stanford's Long-Term Planning Commission, might have been 7 years ago, was to say, I see a line of sight to how an AI can be an amplifier in every academic discipline other than maybe theoretical physics. And even theoretical physics, maybe, right? And so, what would the AI do? And if you wanted to do this exercise yourself, just think about what if, like, it's a 1,000x better than a specialized search engine. And each of these disciplines could use a specialized search engine. Well, imagine that, 1,000x better. That would be a useful AI tool in that. Doesn't mean it will write the papers. Could, obviously, in some ways. But the papers will be much better when it's a combination of them and kind of human conceptualization around it.
I want to pivot a little bit. We have a group of primarily MBA students in here, and I want to pivot to leadership,
Mm.
and in particular, managing explosive growth and scaling of these companies. You've done it, and you started one of the most successful social network companies at LinkedIn, um, and you manage it, and you led it through a period of explosive growth. What are the things that come to mind when thinking about that?
Well, as you certainly know, I did write a book called Blitzscaling. Um, and it partially, like the books so far have been kind of the world as I've discovered it. Whether it's the startup view, each of you should be thinking about your work lives and careers as kind of the entrepreneur of yourself. Doesn't mean you should necessarily start a company. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But you should be thinking about your career path in an entrepreneur way. That was the first one. Alliance, how that interfaces with companies and company organization, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And blitzscaling was, what is the thing that Silicon Valley and to some degree actually China understands that most of the rest of the world doesn't really understand, and how the pace in a globally connected world of how you go from an idea to a transformation of industry, and what are the things that are atypical of that. And so there's like a bunch of principles like embrace chaos, have a disposition to moving fast and then fixing what breaks as you go. There is a chapter on responsible blitzscaling, which is make sure you don't break something that's really bad, right? But that's fine. So those are all part of it. And part of the thing is that for example, when you're doing internet software, which includes obviously mobile, you're basically kind of competing with the whole world. It's not just competing with the person, sitting next to you, the person down the street. And so that's part of the reason why being part of an ecosystem which understands what the speed and the tempo and what is the way you solve key problems like go to market, or what is the modern technology to build on for doing something, is actually, in fact, really, really key.
How do you manage people through that process when you have that vision and you're trying to lead a company through that explosive growth phase?
Well, so there's a whole bunch of principles in the book too. But like, for example, one of them is when you think about, so part of the tempo of scale was scaling number of employees by roughly order of magnitude, like 10, 100,000, et cetera. And then how the organization changes, because by the way, some of what happens in these companies is that change of order of magnitude. Like I've seen companies that have gone from 20 people at the beginning of the year to 800 at the end of the year. Like, okay, how do you do that? And so part of the thing that you realize is that you're not aiming for perfect, you're not aiming for one stable org chart, et cetera. That some of the people that you had who are key leaders at the earlier stages aren't the right leaders of the thing. So for example, like a totally micro piece of advice, but very important for doing these kind of blitzscaling things is, say, okay, you're the head of product in my 30-person organization. You don't say, well, as long as you're doing a good job, you will continue to be the head of product for when we're becoming a 1,000-person organization. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. What you do say is, as long as you're doing well, your job will continue to get bigger. Because by the way, when you've moved from a 30 to a 1,000-person organization, you have a much bigger footprint of what you're doing in this company. It's like your job got bigger. It wasn't necessarily you stayed as head of product. And frequently, as you jump each level of scale, when you're doing this at speed, usually 50% plus of what you would think of as the executive management of the company will change. And you have to be ready for that kind of dynamism, and you have to be ready for making errors and judgments in that. And even though the person did this really great job before, is now no longer the right fit, and you have to have made your early promises, built your relationships of trust, done that in order to change that. And the book's full of stuff like this, because this is things I learned. Blitzscaling, probably the first places where everybody was learning blitzscaling was PayPal.
What are the soft skills that you think are most important in that space? What should we be teaching, and what should we be aspiring to have?
Well, classically, Like, for example, there's Fred Kaufman has this book called Conscious Business, which I really like, which is kind of this notion of thinking about management as compassion, but not just compassion to the individual of whom you are dealing with, but also compassion to the entire people around you. So, for example, you say, oh, this doctor is giving really bad diagnoses. Oh, but it'd be so painful for them if you fire them. It's like, well, remember all their customers, right? All the people they're treating. Like, be compassionate to them too. So you have to have this broad sense of compassion and be compassionate across the whole front. I think that the soft skills are maybe the most central one, which is good, learning institution, is always be learning, right? The soft skills are recognize that when you're moving fast, you're going to be making errors. I mean, like, for example, one of the ways that I, in kind of startup and blitzscaling environments, I will frequently say, look, here's my working decision and judgment. I may not be right, but we have to make the judgment or we have to go wrong. So everyone has to get on board. But I'm not saying that people you disagree with, you're necessarily wrong. It's we have to make that, to operate well, we have to make that decision. So, like, this is actually, I think, one of the things, I forget which chapter it is in the blitzscaling book, but that was a couple books ago. The OODA loop is one of the terms that is used in Silicon Valley. And it's from fighter pilot terminology: observe, orient, decide, act. And in fighter pilots, the reason they teach this is because basically in a dogfight in fighter pilots, the fighter pilot with the faster OODA loop survives and the other one dies. So you really try to get your OODA loop right. Silicon Valley is one of those places that talks about OODA loops for individuals and OODA loops for companies and goes, that has to be functioning right, because the speed of competition is very, very intense. And this is one of the things that people don't understand is, like, for every mega startup that comes out of Silicon Valley, there are between dozens and hundreds, probably, some rarely thousands, of competitors. And by the way, in China, it's thousands and tens of thousands. And so the ones that emerge have fast OODA loops and are really aggressive. And so you have to have the capability of doing that yourself, of instilling that in the culture, of navigating the complexities of you're making all of these decisions very fast. And so, for example, one of the reasons why relative to soft skills of leadership is embrace chaos is to have everyone's first lesson in the counterintuitive rules of blitzscaling is because if everyone understands, like, look, I'm not going to be perfectly informed, we are going to be making some inefficient decisions, but because we have to move fast, have to make decisions, have to learn from them, we do that collectively. And so the always be learning is a key part of that.
Yep. Okay, I want to pivot a little bit before we turn to Q&A and talk about AI, future of work, society. This is a big topic with interesting ideas from all over the spectrum. What are your thoughts, first of all, about AI over the next 3-5 years, thinking about society, and then we can talk a little bit about more specific things. And I want to pivot. I'm not going to talk specifically about the book, but Reid just wrote a book in 2 months with the aid of GPT-4. So, yeah.
10 weeks. It's a little longer than 8 weeks.
2.5 months.
Yes.
So that tells you something about what we're going to be capable of in presently, not in the near future. What are your thoughts?
So, obviously, what people like to do is beat the drum on job replacement, and look, not to be too simplistic about it. There will be, over time, our human organizations adopt much more slowly than usually technologists' availability of technology and changing the jobs happen. But if you have a job that's basically trying to have a human mimic a robot can generally do those jobs better. But really what's going to happen is a lot of transformation. So, for example, if you look at a company and you say, okay, let's say the tools 3 years from now can create 2x better performance or 4x better performance per job. Sales, are you going to fire salespeople? No, you like the 2x, 4x better performance. That's great. So it isn't that human beings are going to be replaced. It's that human beings that are using AI are going to be the people who are going to be getting the jobs. Marketing it's a competitive thing between companies. The composition of some of the jobs may change. So like, for example, if what your job is to do digital form entry into the advertising system, act like a robot, well, that will be greatly accelerated. But the job of how do we position ourselves, get an emotional connection, create a brand, how do we explore this in different ways, how do we bring new kinds of marketing, like content marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So you go through all these. Most of the departments do not end up going, we're trading human jobs down. We are preferring humans that can use AI, right? So
this is a point I want to interject.
Yes.
We need to be teaching people to be able, intelligent consumers and users of AI.
Yes, exactly. Look, even customer service, which tends to be the here's your script, follow the script, e.g. behave like a robot. Look, that behave like a robot, those jobs as that will go down, but maybe customer service now becomes a how do you build a relationship, right? So yes, you have an AI that solves a problem of my thing arrived and it's broken, or I don't know how to use it, or da-da-da, and a robot, an AI helps that. But then it goes, hey, and are you interested in engaging more with our company? And then that goes to a human-assisted AI as a way of doing it. So anyway, maybe, right, speculation, but jobs change. So some tasks get really accelerated, others become newly possible. And so, like, that happens even in the educational institutions. So.
It does. What do you think about the speed of change, though? I mean, sometimes society is good at adapting when the speed of change is intergenerational, but intragenerational change tends to be difficult. What do you have thoughts on that?
We'll never look. Part of society continues to accelerate, like back in futurism and postmodernism, they thought we were at the maximum speed, and we're much faster than that now. You deploy a new product in the internet, and it can be in the hands of billions of people in days, actually. It doesn't usually play that quite way, but it can do that. Yeah. And that kind of speed is new and challenging. And it's one of the reasons why I'm glad you kind of brought it back there, because I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about the transition being totally easy. It is good that AI can help us with the transition. Like you say, hey, we're now building autonomous trucks, and even though we have a shortage of truck drivers today, if every manufacturer started building a autonomous truck, only autonomous trucks now, it'd take over 10 years to replace. There'd be over half the trucks on the road would be autonomous trucks. But you say, okay, what happens when the truck driver goes, well, wait a minute, this is a job I like, and the job's decreasing and going away. You say, well, okay, look, it happens. It's, by the way, makes the road safer, makes it greener in terms of grid management and a bunch of other stuff. But here's an AI that can help you figure out what other kinds of jobs you might like, help you learn to do those jobs, help you do those jobs. And so that kind of transformation is, I think, very possible, but it is difficult to have the transformations, and the speed, specifically, is no longer, a little bit of the educational system is built on the industrial model, which is you train people, you had your training thing, and now you go work. And it's like, well, you're going to have to always be learning, right? It's like the training that you get today, in 5 years, if we're making progress, that will have been modified, and then not just by working through experience, but you'll have to be constantly learning.
Okay, good. I want to pivot briefly on policy, which is an area that you're also involved. And in particular, we're thinking about domestic policy, thinking a little bit about geopolitics and AI, and in addition to that, thinking about what should be the role of these technology companies in educating us also in thinking about good policies versus restrictive policies that may actually stifle innovation, which I think is an area that you're really against that latter part. But what's the state of play right now, and what do you think we're going to be seeing over the next few years?
Well, our tool set to do really great things and also mitigate bad things is only increasing. So for example, one parallel is as you get these AI models larger and larger, they're actually, we find and empirically that it's easier to align them with human interests and to have them go, like for example, if someone comes to the AI and says, I'm really depressed, I'm thinking about doing self-harm, as opposed to saying, oh, here's a good website about how to do self-harm, it goes, oh, that's really difficult. I mean, are you talking to people, right? Have you thought about talking to somebody? And I think you might be able to manage this, and so and to respond in a more aligned and helpful way.
Sure.
And that's part of the reason why I'm so like get to the future.
Yeah.
You start imposing, let's slow down, let's stop right now. It's like, well, actually that's harm. Like, for example, if we have a medical assistant on every phone, no, let's not slow down until we have that available to everybody who has a phone. And let's try to give everyone access to a phone in some way. It may be access to the village's phone, it may be access to the neighbor's phone, but something along those lines. Now, that obviously doesn't mean, like if you say you're trying to get from point A to point B in a journey, like going 5 miles an hour doesn't help you. But that doesn't mean you don't navigate well. You get into the curve, you slow down for the curve as you're going, because it's like, don't go over the cliff. And so, you have to be smart about how you're navigating. Now, one of the things I think about, on these policy questions is, well, take for example, this notion of there is transformation. So for example, I remember about a year ago, it's one of the reasons the first chapter in Impromptu was about education, that there was a large amount of consternation from the university establishment about, oh my God, this is changing our college application process. And you're like, well, by the way, that's called progress. And yes, the intermediate is difficult and you have to figure out the new, but the fact that it's like, well, we've been doing this, for X decades and this way, and we're very comfortable doing it this way. By the way, that was the complaint that weavers had with a loom, right? Like, we're very comfortable with our weaving. And you're like, yes, but if we go to the loom, we can get much more clothing for everybody. That's a good thing. And we just have to help human beings make that transition in various ways. And so I think that the question when you think about policy is too often the very natural thing is, how do we slow down? How do we stop? And the question is, how do we drive to the right locations? What are the things? So like, for example, one of the things I sometimes sit with politicians in this country and I say, well, would you like a return to vigor in the manufacturing industry? And they're like, yes, those are great middle-class jobs, et cetera. Like, okay, what's your industrial policy for getting there? Like, well, okay, yeah, you can't, protectionism doesn't really work. It may work for a decade, and after that, you're handing a much worse future to your children. AI and robotics is the best way for rejuvenating it. And they say, well, but doesn't it just all become robot factories? Like, look, if it's all robot factories, we have other interesting other opportunities. But actually, in fact, when you look at Amazon centers, as they get more automated, they do ship more packages per person who works there. Again, productivity, and progress. But they also hire more people, right? And so that's what the capitalism progress is. And that's what I think is the kind of thing that we should be looking at here.
Are there specific things that you think our policy conversations needs to be focusing on over the next few years?
Well, so for example, let's take the medical assistant. Right now, most of the builders of these models try to steer them away from giving any medical advice in any particular way because they don't want to take liability. If I were, unless they're in a medical circumstance, as there's at least one person doing that in the audience, because I've met him just before. But like, for example, the general, like GPT-4 and so forth, is kind of steering more away from that. I actually think that if I was a proactive policy person, I would say, look, here's the lines that you have to color in. You have to say, I'm not a doctor. You have to say, can you see a doctor? You have to say, I'm not sure of my advice to you, right? And you really should be trying to seek medical advice as much as possible. But then within that, You can give some answers, and we should be following up and we should be seeing how that works. Then you could start provisioning a medical assistant on every phone, right? And somebody who, because, one of the, I personally think that one of the things as we progress as societies, medical care should be offered by the society. I don't think it necessarily go through employer, but we have a lot of people who are uninsured here, which means they don't have access. Well, this could be a way to begin to help there. And that would be something that, for example, be proactive, where you're shifting to trying to get somewhere to make a positive result happen, is something that can be done on a policy basis.
I'm getting a signal to go to Q&A, but I wanted to ask you about your quick thoughts on AI, social networks, and the election cycle.
Quick thoughts?
In 60 seconds,
42.
because we need to go to Q&A.
Look, part of what I've been an advocate for, LinkedIn obviously shows this too, is that, and this is what I think technology companies need to realize, we're not just offering products to individuals, but as you get to a certain level, you also have to have society as a customer. And it's like, how do you manage with society and the group of folks? And democracies work when we collectively learn. You want these networks to engage in collective learning, and collective learning means learning towards what is actually true, right? So if you have, like, for example, if you have information ecosystems that are claiming that the 2020 election was stolen, and when you see through such things as the Dominion lawsuit that the Fox, opinion commentators who are perpetrating this were texting each other knowing that it was wrong, right? That's a serious problem. That's something that society should learn about. You should have learning ecosystems in order to get there. And so it doesn't mean you have a provider of truth. Like I, at LinkedIn, will tell you what is true and what is not true. That's a challenge. What you want is to have a learning ecosystem by which, that's one of the reasons why, like when we think about almost any system, any institution, we say judgment of truth is important, we do panels of human beings. We do it in like science, in like academic journals and reviewers. We do it in juries. We do it in studies in science. All of these things, like, okay, how do we deploy those as learning systems? That's what we should be working towards.
So we have, 5 months to go?
A few more than that.
Yes,
Right.
7. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Do we have mics going around, or?
There seems to be a mic there.
Okay, all right. So we'll start here.
And there.
Thank you for coming today. I'm first year student here. Question is, if you're 30 years old today, what would, and you're willing to take a venture, willing to learn, what would be an opportunity that you would capitalize today?
So one of the things that I said in the Startup Review is that people kind of underrate certain kinds of decisions. So one decision is to invest for getting soft assets versus hard assets. So it's network around you, knowledge, et cetera. Now, a lot of people hear you are investing in knowledge, is good. Join networks and industries more than specific companies. Companies can be good, but like which networks and which industries are the ones that will be amplifying and growing, right? And then do anything to get into it. So like, for example, look, I'm not unhappy with where my career has ended up and what I've ended up doing. But like, for example, if I would go back and think about like what things maybe I would have done that would be smarter decisions, would be, I was oriented when I left Apple to go to Fujitsu on, I must be a product manager. I must have product manager as my experience. Actually, in fact, maybe the decision would have been go to Netscape because it's an online revolution, and being part of the online revolution is what matters more than the Fujitsu. So choose kind of where the networks and industries that fit you and fit the kind of things you would want to do. So for example, I guess I won't call out industries and get certain people grumpy with me. But there are industries that are on the decline. Be serious. Like if you don't want, like be thoughtful. If you go, I must go do that industry, great. But realize you're choosing an industry where the tide is in front of you, not behind you, right? So that kind of set of choices. Now, obviously, software technology, artificial intelligence can be part of that cognitive industrial revolution. But then the way you begin thinking, where am I contrarian and right? Where do I have an interesting potential thesis that can break out and do something extraordinary? Like maybe people aren't that focused right now, like only small groups are focused on drug discovery and AI. I will go do that. I have a biology background. I don't know anything about your background. So I'm just, kind of throwing out things. And part of what I chartered in the Startup Review was to say, look, you've got your set of assets, you've got your aspirations, you have market reality. You're doing a product across that to have the greatest competitive differentiation. That's the kind of thing to be looking at.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm just curious, how's your investment thesis and what kind of company you like the most and what drives you to make the decision to invest the Airbnb? Thank you.
Well, I'll do the Airbnb one because that's easy. Because it also has a fun story. So the first person who pitched Airbnb to me pitched it as couch surfing. And it caused me to not meet the founders for a year because I went, oh, couch surfing is not a very good idea. It just won't work as a general strategy. And so, these other people were telling me these founders were great. First lesson I learned is do not allow someone's pitch to you that's not the founders themselves to overly condition you to negative because that person got it wrong. It was within 3 minutes of meeting the 3 founders that I was like, okay, I'm going to make you an offer to invest. Come in to pitch the venture. This was on a Sunday. Come in and pitch the partnership tomorrow, et cetera. And we pitched the partnership, and David Z was my most valuable, reason I'm at Greylock, my most valuable board member at LinkedIn. So we went through the pitch. The founders went out. David Z looked at me and said, every VC has to have a deal to fail on. Airbnb can be yours. Right? We talk very bluntly to each other around a partnership table. And I was like, that's interesting. I think that increases my interest in investing. Contrarian and right, remember? 6 months later, data hadn't changed. David came to me and said, okay, David's a learning machine, he's great. He came to me and said, you were totally right, I was wrong. What did you see that I didn't see? And I said, look, everything you said was right. The local unions will hate it, especially in the hotels. Cities won't like the kind of rezoning of stuff. Neighbors will be uncomfortable. Maybe something bad's gonna happen, a murder or something that would be bad in these things. All of that could quell this investment. They have good plans, and this is the way the world should be, which is suddenly travelers have a chance to get much more unique experiences, connections to local community, kind of where they are. Hosts can become small entrepreneurs, offering their room, their apartment. They can innovate in ways that hotels actually don't innovate. It can be cheaper, it can be more expensive and more delightful. It can be the whole range. And that's actually, in fact, the way the world should be. So I think if we navigate those risks, we can create something that's really amazing. And I think, these 3 founders have, potentially what it takes. There's always a risk coefficient. That's kind of canonically about how I look at investments. Can't comment on the most recent investments because they're still stealth, but that was the reason I answered Airbnb in a little bit more depth.
There was a question over there, yeah.
Cool. Thanks for being here, Lei, MBA 25. 2-part question. First, do you think there are any arguments to open sourcing AI that have merit? And then second, do you feel as though policymakers are getting ahead of the tech so they can regulate it more properly than sort of the Web 2 ecosystem, thinking 2016, the bad actors already existed, and we're letting some of that influence happen without anybody really paying attention? Do you feel policymakers are putting their ear more to what's being built and truly understand what's happening?
Let's see. So on the first question, let's see. I do think that like generally speaking, open sourcing software is something I'm broadly sympathetic to. So I think there's a bunch of different kind of like small open source models that are totally good to do. I think enabling entrepreneurship, enabling academic work, having openness and examination is all good. And so if you can look at a model and know, because by the way, these models can be post-trained once they're out in the world. So you say, I did safety training and then I released it. It's like, well, the safety training can be undone. So you say, well, I trained it not to tell you how to make, anthrax. And yeah, I can untrain it and it can do that. And then suddenly you have a lot more people who can follow a recipe for how to create anthrax. Not good relative to, public health. And so that's kind of roughly on the open source thing. And I'm trying to figure out ways to say, how do you get some percentage of open source without 100%? Like, how do you have it say you have broader access, which is good, but not like terrorists or crazy people or criminals or rogue states? So that's one. Now, two, the problem is you build technology, it does a bunch of good things, and you get some challenges. And at that point in hindsight, everyone goes, well, it's really obvious how you should have regulated back then, you should have done it. Well, yeah, but by the way, if you try to regulate beforehand, your picture of what the real issues are and what are the ways to navigate actually, in fact, are almost certainly, even amongst experts, to be inaccurate. And so you prevent potentially a lot of good things, and maybe you prevent bad things, but you also just make a lot less progress. And so my general view on like, for example, when regulators talk to me about regulating anything, including, for example, social networks, I say, look, try to define your outcomes in a crisp way and say, here, I want more of these outcomes and less of these. How would you make that work? Example, social networks. We had that New Zealand instance where, basically a crazy terrorist was filming murders. You say, okay, I want to have less murders. Well, what you do is you say, okay, here, you have to audit it, you have to run it through your auditors, and we'll have a fine infrastructure. So you showed one murder by accident, okay, that's $10,000. You showed 100 murders on the same incidents, well, that's $1 million. And da-da-da-da. And by the way, the tech ecosystem will figure out a way to keep it very small. And so that's the kind of thing that is the right way to be thinking about kind of regulation in these issues. But of course, then you have to do the hard work of thinking about what are the outcomes that you're trying to steer away from, which is the real work, as opposed to saying, just stop until you know you're perfect. Which, if you did that, like today's lens for evaluating technology, aspirin wouldn't be approved, cars wouldn't be approved, if they were starting at the beginning. So you have to say, no, how do we learn as we go and iterate and add seatbelts, add, like as you go.
There was a question right behind, and then we're going to go there.
Hi, thanks for coming. And my question is about inflection AI. I think inflection AI is maybe the best large language model at understanding and expressing emotions. And I'm curious about what's the secret of achieve that? And why can't GPT-4 and Gemini do the same thing? Thank you.
The secrets of our training development.
We're out of time.
I think it's best if I'm just honest and say, that's part of the trade secrets, right? I think it's reproducible. I think other people, one of the things in technology is people see it, they realize that they can produce it as well. But there was years of work by very smart people to make that happen.
My name is Felipe. Thank you very much for coming. My question is regarding your background. You studied symbolic systems and philosophy. I'd love to understand why you chose to study that and a deeper dive on why you chose to switch to entrepreneurship. How does your background make you a better investor, entrepreneur, or person?
So one of the things that I try to get people to pay attention to is it's not, I think investing is like, oh, you do an analysis, discounted cash flow and market growth and CAC and LTV and all these things that and those are important. But it's actually, when you're imagining the world as it can be, it's a kind of a lens of possibilities. It's a question of what you might be able to construct with the technology. It's how teams operate, how scaling works. and a bunch of other things. And so, one of the things that when I was teaching one of the Y Combinator classes with Sam Altman, Sam asked me, well, what do I believe that most of the people in this room don't believe? And I was like, well, in order to be a good entrepreneur, you need to have an explicit theory of human nature, right? And then when you're building your product and thinking about it, you say, here's what I think human nature is, and here is how I think people will respond well to my product, and I will help them elevate and become better through it. And that's one of the areas where philosophy is useful. And in the case of symbolic systems, although I got into philosophy from thinking about like what things that symbolic systems need to learn, it was kind of questions around how do you take precision in thinking about thinking, or thinking about how languages work, and how do you use that in the artifacts of what you're creating. And I think that's much more important than many other things when you're doing technology creation. Now, obviously, you have to understand something about technology too, surprise, but anyway.
Okay, we'll take one last question back there, and then we'll end.
Thank you for sharing, Angela, MBA 25. I have a question for you. Do you think AI will fundamentally challenge the importance of human relationship and interaction, especially in those industries that are where human relationship is very, very much the center, for example, K-12 schools? Do you think that, we say that, teacher-student relationship is one of the most important thing in determining a student's, growth and performance? Do you think that AI will eventually challenge or modify that in any sense?
Well, I think it'll transform because it'll add in, for example, like an infinitely patient tutor, say, in the educational system. So as opposed to, currently where you have a teacher who says, look, I'm responsible for X students, I only have a limited amount of time, and if a student's not getting it right, I have a limited time to debug it and spend time with it. You have something that will actually help in that circumstance. I don't think it'll replace, because as a gestural comparison, human beings do not play chess as well as AIs anymore, full stop. But we have more people watching human beings play chess with each other. We are human-oriented. We are people-oriented. That's kind of like we're tribal pack animals. And so I think broadly, even though there will be some people who go, oh, no one understands me, this AI is my only friend, and we'll have some of that weird function. I think we build AIs like Pi to say, hey, let me help you connect with your friends, is I think much healthier, and I think broadly, and I think people will naturally head in that direction anyway, because we like human connection in various ways. And so I think it can be transformative but amplifying, whether it's education, medical, all kinds of things. I think it will be a helpful thing, but it will transform.
Okay. Reid, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for engaging us.
I hope you enjoyed that incredible conversation between Reid Hoffman and Dean Kostis Maglaris. Hoffman is one of the most influential and visionary entrepreneurs and investors in the AI industry. He believes that AI is not only a technological innovation, but also a cultural and social transformation that will redefine how we work, learn, and live. He calls this the cognitive revolution, and he urges business leaders to embrace it and adapt to it, or risk being disrupted by it. And as he said, always be learning. Learn how AI can help you succeed in the cognitive era. Stay connected with CBS to learn more about how the school is preparing students for the AI future by following us on social media. Thanks for listening.